The question I will be exploring today is whether culture impacts the experience of psychosis. But first of all, we must define what psychosis is. And generally speaking, people define psychosis as losing contact with reality, which generally means seeing or hearing things that other people don't see and having terrible explanations to justify it. Psychosis may include things such as delusions, which are very strong beliefs that are still sustained even when there is clear evidence that the thing that is being believed is wrong. Psychosis may also include hallucinations, which can be visual or auditory, and it can also result in disorganized speech, where the person is making all of these different associations which seem very confusing, or in some cases also result in catatonic behavior. The thing about psychosis is that some people who are listening now might be asking, well, what differentiates, for example, the psychedelic experience from a psychotic experience? And there are some elements to this, and this is why the epistemic argument that is used to define psychosis as simply losing touch with reality is far from perfect, because classifying these experiences in such a way might take away some of the information that people experience in these altered states of consciousness. But generally speaking, to differentiate between a psychedelic experience and a psychotic experience, the term which is used to differentiate both is insight and integration. So generally in a psychedelic experience, one exits that experience integrating some knowledge and may come out of it with a healthier sense of self or a feeling of unity with the environment around them, and with a greater ability to make sense of the narrative of one's life. While in a psychotic experience, what we often see is a disrupted sense of self, which also happens in the psychedelic experience, but this disrupted sense of self tends to carry on after the psychotic experience. And there is no natural rebuilding or integration of the self. While in a psychedelic experience, the person may come out and they live in a sort of positive, effective framework, the person who is suffering from psychosis may continue to experience highly disturbing and distressing situations, such as feelings of derealization, depersonalization, and just an overwhelming sense of chaos. So we can use this to define some differences between the psychedelic experience and the psychotic experience, where in the psychedelic experience there is some integration of the subjective experience of that altered state of consciousness, while in psychosis the person fails to integrate the elements that they experienced during that altered state of consciousness. When we look at the history of psychosis, we find a rich history, with the conceptualization of psychosis in 1841 by the German physician Carl Friedrich Cannstatt. At that time, psychosis was also termed as psychic neurosis, and its meaning was generally associated with the idea of insanity. And the term psychosis, if we go back to the Greek root or the meaning of the word, it generally meant some illness of the mind. However, during the 19th century, which was a period filled with development in the field of psychiatry, different groups were forming to argue why mental disorders and these special psychological phenomena were actually happening. One of such debates was between somaticists versus mentalists. Somaticists such as Friedrich and Haas believed that mental disorders were caused by some combination of physical and somatic variables, although these were not to be found in the brain, but in other parts of the body, such as the abdomen. Sometime later, Heinrich Hoffmann argued that these disorders were caused by psychological factors, but such factors were, for example, an excess of passion or some degree of wrongdoing. In this moment, the idea that the brain produces the mind wasn't necessarily well accepted, so we had all of these different fields that were debating the origins of these disorders. So often people who suffered from mental disorders were seen as moral failures. They were suffering from that mental disorder because somehow in their life they did something that completely went against moral guidelines, and now they were paying for it. Their soul was paying for it. However, it is also interesting to go far back to the time of Plato and ancient Greece and look at how people had different perceptions of things that nowadays we recognize as disorders. And so in the case of Plato, he looked at mania, which is one of the phases of bipolar disorder, which is most prominent in bipolar type 1, which is a state of heightened energy where people tend to do a lot of very risky behaviors and feel like they have a lot of insight about the world and they feel extremely confident. And mania can be highly destructive and also toxic for the brain. But at that time, Plato considered that mania could sometimes be a form of God-given madness, and he sort of differentiated it into 4 different types. one of them being called prophetic madness, which was given by the god Apollo, poetic madness, which was inspired by the muses, ritual or thelastic mania, which was a gift of Dionysus, and erotic mania, which was a gift of Eros and Aphrodite. And so the interesting philosophical proposition here is that sometimes these altered states of consciousness, which break down rationality, could be seen as a form of insight that sometimes could overcome the limitations of the rational mind. So this was just a very short overview of the history of how we tend to perceive these mental phenomena. Additionally, throughout history, those who were suffering from psychotic spectrum disorders might have been classified as having supernatural abilities, being possessed by demons, or simply ignored and taken to horrible places where they would carry out the rest of their lives. However, with the Industrial Revolution and a bigger focus on productivity, these people who were impaired by their psychotic spectrum disorders became more visible. And as we started drifting away from supernatural explanations, the study of psychosis became a medical pursuit. And although currently we have some different explanations and neurobiological mechanisms to explain psychosis, there is something that is captured by the field of cultural psychiatry that we need to take into consideration, which is to focus on the phenomenology of the psychotic experience and also understand how the cultural background of individuals impact their experience of psychosis and even help us mediate and personalize treatments. Now, one way to simplify the impact of culture on the experience of psychosis is to look at two poles of culture, Western and non-Western cultures. Generally speaking, in Western cultures, we are more rigid with the boundaries that differentiate reality and fantasy, and we tend to permit less degrees of freedom to what we can experience and still call truth and real. In non-Western cultures, there tends to be a less rigid approach to what separates reality and fantasy, which means that phenomena such as psychosis may be less likely to be labeled as pathological in non-Western cultures when compared to Western cultures. And one implication here is that if you experience psychosis in a place where that experience might be categorized as a divine experience and not as a pathology, it would make sense to assume that the experience of psychosis in such a place would cause less distress than, for example, in a place which has these very rigid boundaries between reality and imagination. However, that hypothesis isn't necessarily true. We have literature comparing positive psychotic experiences in the Netherlands and Nigeria, and the levels of distress were similar between both countries, even though they have two different epistemic approaches to psychosis. Additionally, what also happens is that those in cultures that see psychosis as something such as a divine call or as a transcendental experience, they might not seek treatment as they see it as something that is completely normative. And as we know, psychosis is toxic for the brain, so if we have repeated episodes of psychosis, this is likely going to cause some sort of cognitive deterioration. That being said, when we look at the phenomenological characteristics, so the subjective experience of psychosis between different cultures, we have some literature which shows some interesting findings. For example, the auditory hallucinations, so the hearing of voices, when we compare between Chinese and American populations, some literature has found that the voices in the Chinese population seem to be more benevolent than that in the American population. Additionally, for the Chinese population, men tended to have more political voices, while women tended to have more religious ones. We also have literature stating that auditory and visual hallucinations tended to be more frequent in African patients, while persecutory and grandiose delusions tended to happen at higher rates in African, Pakistani, and Latino groups, while delusions of reference, which refers to a belief that a set of unrelated or neutral events have a big significance and are directly linked to an individual's life. This could be, for example, watching an advertisement on television where someone winks and you believe that the winking is directed at you, or for example that you are receiving secret messages only directed to you through your phone. Well, I guess this one is a little bit trickier because nowadays with the algorithms we are receiving content that is completely tailored to what we like to watch, or even we have these algorithms that seem to know us better than we know ourselves, so this gets a little bit complicated, but these are some examples of these types of delusions. But these delusions of reference seem to be more common among white populations. And then, of course, depending on how you perceive psychosis, of whether you adopt a more of a biological explanation or whether you adopt a supernatural or a bewitchment model to explain that experience, then that, of course, has an impact on whether you look for treatment or not. So this means that the cultural background of someone who is experiencing this type of psychological phenomena may predict or indicate whether they will look for help. Overall, what all of this points to is that we need to have an embodied approach to the understanding of psychosis, and that it is useful to understand the cultural aspects of the person that is experiencing this. And this also points to the idea that we should pay attention to the phenomenological nature of the person's psychosis. And this is where psychotherapeutic approaches, alongside medications, have a huge importance. So overall, it doesn't seem wise to just label psychotic experience as a meaningless experience that just should be discarded, but as something that should be explored through a biological approach and a phenomenological approach. To conclude this video, I would also like to state that psychosis isn't a disorder, it's a symptom which might be caused by a whole different array of disorders. So hopefully you found this video interesting, and if you'd like for me to maybe take a deep dive on some of the aspects that I mentioned today, please write down in the comments, and thank you for watching this video.